Delhi-Agra stretch boasts of 6 major UNESCO World Heritage Sites that also attract millions of tourists each year. From the Qutub complex and Humayun's tomb in Delhi to the Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, the Taj Mahal and the Red Fort, which brings back the focus to Delhi. These monuments represent the story of the Sultanate and Mughal periods. However, despite their popularity, few people know their full story. On the ground, local guides have often created their own narratives, mixing local tales and facts. Shashank Shekhar Sharma's book, Delhi, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, Monuments, Cities and Connected Histories, acts as a guide to tell us about these monuments and how they have evolved. And joining me to discuss his book, Delhi, Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, is author Shashank Shekhar Sinha. Shashank, thanks so much for joining us today. Wonderful to have you with us. It's interesting to look at a book like yours, look at the familiar terrain that everybody is, knows the story of, so to say, but then understand how layers and layers make up even the regular fare. And for me, it was very interesting because there were a lot of cross connections that you brought together. And let me start off with one very important facet of the book. The fact that for 600 years, the triad of Delhi, Agra, and Fatehpur Sikri was really the power center of India. I think let's start off with that. As a historian, what made you delve into this period, into these three capitals?
Thanks, Minnie. I think it was a larger part of my exploration, and something which was, quite different from, a very different motivation was, I was, it started with the, the idea of monuments, and the criticality of monuments in the writing of history. And I realized that there are very significant gaps. Two things became very common to me. One is that there were very significant gaps as far as academic and popular understandings of history is concerned. But more than that, one of the things which was very striking was that the monuments are very, very critical sites of public consumption of historical knowledge. And not just about monuments, but about the related historical periods. So that got me, into writing this book, or thinking about this book at least, basically. And the second part was that I thought, where do I begin my journey, right? And then I thought I had been writing, a series for Frontline, and I had also been writing a series for Wire, about different aspects of heritage, And then when I realized that, look, even if I look at the 6 topmost monuments and 3 cities which are top tourist destinations, right? These are the most visited UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the 6 sites which are listed in this book by way of 6 individual chapters. And I found very significant gaps in what is being, produced in academia and the way it is being consumed in public domain. And then I realized, oh my God, there are a lot of gaps here. Forget about the other monument. Let's do this, So that's how I got into this 3 cities and this 6 this thing. So it's and then I thought, well, that was one was the criticality of this, and the second was, devise a suitable framework. Is there a framework, that an adequate framework that you could develop? And
right. So you've seen the cities through these 6 monuments, which include, of course, in chronology, the Qutub Minar, the Humayun's tomb, the Agra Fort, the Fatehpur Sikri complex, Taj Mahal, and the Red Fort. But before I get to some of these and some of the interesting stories that you've picked out, I must ask you this question about what are the myths most propagated by tour guides in these cities? Because when I went to Kumbhalgarh, I remember the local guide, and I always go to the local guide to understand what they're telling about these monuments, And the local guide very, very authoritatively told me about Rana Kumbha being 7'5" tall and being a giant of a man. The fact is that for many tourists, this becomes their window into India's past. And sadly, very little checks and balances have been put out there. What are the stories being said? So what are the big myths that you have busted, you think, of popular folklore when it comes to these particular monuments?
There are quite a few, and not just it's not just about tourists, Mini. It's also about students of history, because history is not very applied subject in many universities, because there's not a very applied in terms of field visits and things like that. So even students of history, when they visit the monuments, they plug in the gaps in their understanding of this. So it's like a refresher course or something like that, or rebrushing their knowledge of history. But all the different monuments have different kinds of stories associated with them. So when you talk about let's begin in that order. So when you talk about Qutub's tomb, is that this strange dichotomy between glorifying the minar and seeing the mosque as a hunting place, basically, which reminds you about bloodshed, which reminds you about violence, basically, right? Whereas it was meant to be a sanctuary of Islam. So it had a positive connotation when, in 2020s, people were migrating to North Indian towns and Delhi, and until Tutmesh, it becomes a sanctuary of Islam. So a lot of people are migrating, seeking new fortunes and seeking new livelihoods and settling in Delhi. So this is about, this thing. Agra Fort, again, I talk about, there's a big myth about, this, these were not gates of Somnath eventually, but they talk about it as gates of Somnath. These were gates of Mahmud of Ghazni's tomb, basically. When you talk about Humayun's tomb, Humayun's tomb, it's more about the renovation, because Humayun's tomb is a slightly different class in itself in terms of so it's got more positioning in terms of renovation. But sadly enough, not much work has happened, has been published on Humayun's tomb. When you talk about Fatehpur Sikri, all tourist guides would tell you, there are lots of stories. So they'll show you that, the door through which Anarkali escaped, they'll show you, they talk about, the curse of Zanina, which is the courtesan, and how it led to the decline of Fatehpur Sikri. When you talk about Taj Mahal, popular histories, sometimes take precedence over the academic history. So whether this whole concept of the hands being chopped off, or whether there was a black Taj, whether Taj was being made by a foreign architect, all those things take precedence, And then, basically, and they have become a very part of, the history of the monument. And then sixth, when you talk about Red Fort, there are lots of stories, set in the 1857. But one of the things, I talk about more than controversies about Red Fort, the added layers about Red Fort. For instance, the afterlife, how does it become a site for Independence Day celebrations, basically. So those kinds of things, basically. So there are a lot of things and stories about Bahadur Shah Jafar, and interesting anecdotes. But in terms of controversy, basically, or in terms of I think an interesting afterlife, I thought that the Red Fort story about how it becomes a site for Independence Day celebrations becomes important.
This is very interesting. As a historian, what do you attribute this to, Shashank? Is this just the romance of these stories that get it? Because somewhere there is absolutely right. The moment you talk about Qutub Minar, you talk about the mosque being built, and there is a inscription that says it was built after destroying 27 temples and Hindu and Jain temples, for instance. But you have made a point, which is a very valid point, that desecrating rival areas of worship was something that was a norm with any army, irrespective of which way they did, And this is also borne out by works of other historians like Richard Eaton, etc., who have pointed out that it was par for the course, So you've explained that. So give us a flavor of what we are up against when you're talking about the factual history versus the popular myth making, especially these days around history.
See, I think there are two aspects of it. The first aspect that you pointed out in the context of the mosque is that I draw on the work of writers who are specialists on it, basically. And then, these kinds of things were cross-cultural, It's not, in any way justifying their act, Sure. I, want to set the record straight on that, because it's not justifying of this thing. But when you look at the context of those times, basically, these things are, cross-cultural. They're happening across there. So in the south, there are fights between Hindu kings, and they are, destroying each other's temples or taking away, important souvenirs or artifacts from the temples, basically. So they're fighting amongst them. In the peninsular India, there's a lot of cases about that as well. And then there is the second side of it is basically is that we tend to be very dismissive about the popular histories, basically, and that is when academic histories become very dry, basically, and less appealing to this, right? So what I get into that, is basically when I look into the accessibility of these accounts, what I also try and do is approach it from a different framework, which is that rather being dismissive about this folklore and popular histories, I talk about how they came into being, right? So one story is being supplemented by or substituted by another story, and my take is that if you tell them in a story format that how the myth of Black Taj came into being, it's as interesting as the idea of when you narrate the story of how the Black Taj came into being, right? Or so I look at from the time how it came into being, basically in the sense how did the story come into being, rather than whether Black Taj existed or not, or being dismissive about it. So there are two aspects. I always feel that you need to be to make a public connect, which is because, and that's very important in the context of of the crisis that discipline faces at times, basically very many disciplines face at time, that is lacking a public connect, right? So you need to make things more comprehensible to them and strike public. And when you talk about striking a public connect, these stories are very important. Popular histories are very important. Folklore is very important. Legends are very important. And I try and bridge this gap in terms of bringing the latest academic research on the subject in an accessible way so that it makes sense to them.
No, kudos to that, because I think, Shashank, that is absolutely required, because I think academia cannot no longer sit in ivory towers and say that, hey, we will ignore what is happening on the ground because we don't agree with it and it's too banal to look at. But the fact is, that's where the myth making happens, and especially in today's era of internet, fake news and fake history, the bulk of the myth making happens around that, and there has to be a counter force. Let's go back to the very essence of the book, which is the emergence of these three cities. You trace it, Delhi's rise starts somewhere in the 11th, 12th century, where it becomes an important center. And we had Swapna Little talk about the rise of Delhi, because you've done a lot of work with her on that. But what makes it interesting is how it marked an entry into the medieval era and how geography played a role, because, there were so many cross connections. And Agra, I didn't realize how it was perhaps, many more spreading out of armies that kind of led the capital shifting from Delhi to Agra. So I would like you to explain that to our audiences.
Two things. First is that, one small clarification, which is that, the capitals did not only shift to, Agra and Fatehpur Sikri temporarily, Agra for a longer time and Fatehpur Sikri. But these were connected with the movements of the emperors, right? So the capitals would be, some of them would be very short term. So when the emperor would move, basically, the courtiers, the staff, everything would move together. Right, and so there's somewhere they were very small, stays, basically, and they would move continuously because they either wanted to quell a revolt or acquire a new territory, or they would move for recreational purposes. So that whenever they would settle down for a longer period of time, that would emerge as some kind of a capital. And I talk about how the camps also emerge as some kind of an on-field capitals. The camps in the Deccan, because the Mughal emperors, particularly towards Aurangzeb, spends a lot of time basically in those tents, which are mobile cities. The Mughal tents were mobile cities, and they become some kind of a temporary capital. And for a very long time, Jahangir, Akbar, or Aurangzeb spent a long time at Lahore as well, right? Muhammad bin Tughlaq shifts to Daulatabad. So there are various instances of capital shifting. But the interesting bit is, when it leads to your question, is that they'll all come back to the Delhi-Agra axis. And that is an interesting one, because these are bound by by the Yamuna, basically Delhi and Agra both connected by Yamuna. The importance of Delhi was that once you have that, so Punjab's emerges as some kind of a springboard, and once you reach Delhi, you have a clear territory right up to eastern India. So it allows you for a free movement of goods and services. Right. So in the early stages, Delhi served this purpose, basically very well in terms of the Sultanate period. Right. And then, the Ganga Jamuna Doab being added to it, But how geography starts restricting the growth of the Sultanate, particularly towards the 14th, 15th centuries. When they are the sultans, and all this arrangement could work well if you have strong sultans. If you have weak sultans, then there are a lot of people, lot of armies have become important. The ranas have become important. Lot of local lords have or land or lords have become very important. So your reach has become very, very fragile. And at one point of time, when we see that we talk about Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign, when the empire is the Sultanate is making its reach in South India, this was also one of the weakest points. So the strongest point was also the weakest point, because it's becoming very, very difficult to hold the empire together. So his successor Firoz Shah Tughlaq does what, let the Deccan go and concentrate on Delhi and around, basically, right? Now the shift to Agra comes at a very interesting times, which is during the Lodhi's times, right? Now there are 2 or 3 factors which are very becoming important. It is becoming very difficult for Delhi, and when I say Delhi, I mean the Delhi Sultanate, in the Delhi Sultans, the later Turkish Sultans, to hold this territory together. They have expanded in the Ganga Jamuna Doab, but they were unable to maintain a hold on that. And 2 is that Agra offers, in terms of, they're looking at possibilities. Agra offers a very strategic geographical advantage for 2 or 3 very important regions. A, it gives you a very important access to an agricultural hinterland in the form of Ganga and Jamuna, Ganga Jamuna Doab, basically, right? So there you have a good agricultural hinterland, which was better than the arid Alavari regions, or the associated regions of Delhi. So Agra becomes, gives you access to agriculture. Agra was better connected in terms of trade routes. And Agra also offered you a gateway to Malwa and Gujarat and Rajasthan, right? And Agra also becomes important because a lot of trade and agriculture revenues were getting siphoned off because you didn't have a tighter control. So this revenue slippages or leakages is what they're able to do well. So Agra comes at a very interesting point in the career of the Sultanate, where they are able to maintain their hold in a better way, considering where the Sultanate had reached. But even when they have shifted their career to Agra, the interconnections do not stop. You see the Lodhis erecting their tombs in Delhi. So you see a lot of Lodhi constructions, basically in what is now known as the Lodhi Gardens or South Ex, or in Mehrauli region, even the Soors, doing that. And then later, but one of the other things with it, difference in terms of geography between, and which becomes very important in terms of the reversal of the capitals, in reversal of this, role, is when Shah Jahan shifts his capital back to Shahjahanabad. So while Delhi, develops in terms of, leap outs of settlements, basically. So starting from, every dynasty or, a major, period, they are trying to, build up new settlements. So starting from Aravali is moving north, east towards Yamuna, right? And all along they're trying to develop. So whether it's from Qutub or, which is the Lalkot, or later known as Rai Pithora, to Siri, to Jahanpana, to later, the Purana Killa or the Deen Pana, or before that, Firoz Shah Tughlaq's Firozabad. There are lots of cities that historians talk about, multiple cities. So they are trying to spread in that. Agra, on the contrary, is developing linearly, right? So it is a long stretch along the stretch of Yamuna. Now, when you have a long stretch, long thin stretch, as opposed to leapfrog settlements, what you do is you tend to reach a kind of a saturation point. So it's a long, thin, linear along Yamuna. So after a point of time, it becomes very, very difficult. There is a lot of erosion. There is a lot of encroachment. There are processions happening, people getting injured, So then the time comes to obviously shift the capital to Delhi. But of course, there were other factors involved, including, Shah Jahan's role about, being remembered by some kind of a memorable architecture, which will perpetuate the memory of his rule.
Right. Fascinating, Shashank. I think there's so much to learn in these monuments, but also when you look at these monuments, there is so much to so much that we don't know, right? Because many of these monuments remain, uncharted territory. Even though we think that we know these big, World Heritage Sites, there are monuments within them that we don't know.